In a room meant for democracy, one shocking threat shattered all decorum. The chamber was packed, cameras flashing, voices hushed into uneasy silence. At the center sat Pete Hegseth, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the Liberal host across the table. He wasn't here to debate ideas. He was here to dominate, leaning forward, his voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp, deliberate, meant to intimidate. Each word dripped with menace, as if daring anyone to challenge him. The energy shifted instantly. Lawmakers stiffened in their seats. Aides whispered nervously to each other. This wasn't the fiery rhetoric of a pundit filling airtime. This was a threat, raw and unfiltered, delivered in the sacred halls of Congress. And yet, opposite him, the host did not flinch. Their calm presence, almost unnervingly steady, only seemed to amplify the tension. The contrast was striking: arrogance versus composure, intimidation versus dignity. Every eye in the room locked onto the confrontation, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The atmosphere was electric, heavy with anticipation, and then Pete Hegseth leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. What he said next left the chamber frozen in disbelief. The hearing had begun like so many others. Rows of lawmakers packed into a sterile chamber, the air heavy with policy papers and pointed agendas. The topic on the table was urgent, a debate over national priorities, the kind that could ripple across millions of lives. From healthcare to funding decisions, the stakes already carried weight far beyond the walls of Congress. Everyone knew tempers might flare. No one expected it to spiral into something darker. The tension wasn't just political, it was personal. Each side carried years of resentment, each voice sharpened by the belief that history itself was being written in that moment. The Liberal host, invited to testify, embodied a calm dignity that represented more than one individual. They stood for communities too often silenced, for immigrants, for working families who rarely see their struggles dignified in such spaces. Across from them sat Pete Hegseth, the self-styled warrior for the culture war, a man who thrived on provocation and dominance. It was never going to be a polite conversation. But no one in the chamber could have predicted how quickly the atmosphere would ignite, because what began as a hearing on policy soon became a battlefield for something deeper: respect versus disrespect, truth versus intimidation, the very soul of American democracy. And then, in a moment caught from every angle by the unblinking eyes of television cameras, Pete Hegseth crossed a line. His rhetoric slipped from heated to dangerous, from debating to threatening. Nobody expected the exchange to spiral into threats, but the cameras captured every second. And what unfolded next would grip the entire nation. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded in that chamber, you have to understand Pete Hegseth himself. For years, he has built his brand not on reasoned debate or careful analysis, but on fire. On Fox News, his style is unmistakable, confrontational, theatrical, designed to inflame rather than inform. He doesn't merely disagree with opponents, he ridicules them, sneering with the confidence of a man who believes volume equals victory. Hegseth's persona is stitched together with the language of patriotism. He wraps himself in the flag, invokes military service, and frames his rhetoric as love for country. But beneath the red, white, and blue slogans lies a darker reality. Time and again, his commentary has chipped away at the very principles of democratic discourse. Where democracy requires listening, he interrupts. Where it demands respect, he mocks. Where it thrives on accountability, he doubles down on defiance. This contradiction is his trademark. To his supporters, he is a fearless defender of America. To his critics, he is a bully dressed as a patriot. And the truth? It often reveals itself in moments like these when the cameras are rolling, and his instinct for dominance outpaces any sense of restraint. Patterns emerge if you trace his history. On television panels, he is the one shouting over guests, needling them until their composure cracks. On stage, he delivers fiery speeches less about policy and more about personality, casting himself as a warrior in a culture war only he seems desperate to keep alive. He thrives on spectacle, on creating moments that go viral, not because they enlighten, but because they enrage. Arrogance fuels his performance, but arrogance has a cost. It blinds him. It convinces him that louder is always stronger, that threats can be mistaken for strength. He has spent so long curating his image as a fighter that he cannot see how often that fight collapses into insecurity. Each outburst betrays not confidence, but fear of irrelevance. Each threat reveals not control, but loss of it. And in the congressional chamber that day, all those contradictions, all those patterns came to the surface. His instinct was not to argue ideas, but to dominate his opponent. He leaned in, his voice rising, his body language swelling with the arrogance of someone who thought the room and the cameras existed for his performance. But what he failed to realize was that the performance was unraveling. The more aggressive he became, the more composed his opponent appeared. The contrast was stark, cinematic, almost too perfect to script. The bully doubling down, the calm voice refusing to yield. And on this day, his trademark aggression would cross an unforgivable line. To fully grasp why the chamber did not crumble under Pete Hegseth's hostility, you have to know the person who sat across from him. The liberal host was not a stranger to confrontation. Their story was carved from struggle that demanded composure, dignity, and an unshakable belief in something bigger than themselves. Long before the cameras ever turned their way, they had walked paths that tested resilience. They came from a family that understood sacrifice, parents who worked long hours, relatives who carried the heavy weight of immigration paperwork, citizenship interviews, and the endless proving of worth in a country that often asked too much of them. Those early experiences forged a quiet strength, teaching them that identity was not something to hide, but something to wield with pride. Their career was not built on chasing fame or spotlight, but on advocacy, on the painstaking work of giving voice to those overlooked. In town halls, in classrooms, in community centers, they had already faced skepticism, dismissiveness, even outright hostility. And yet, time after time, they had learned that the most powerful answer to intimidation is composure. Silence when others expect shouting. Steadiness when others demand chaos. This calmness became their signature. On air, when conservative guests raised their voices, they never took the bait. In interviews, when pressed with cheap shots, they replied with facts that landed like steady arrows. To their audience, immigrants, working-class families, progressives who often felt unseen, the host became a figure of reassurance. They proved that dignity could thrive even under fire, that one could be unshaken even in the loudest storms. And that day in Congress, it was precisely this quality that became their armor. As Hegseth leaned in, fueled by rage and arrogance, the host remained still, unbroken. Their calm was not passive, it was defiant in its refusal to stoop to his level. Every second of composure stripped Hegseth's aggression of power. Every steady breath undermined his attempt at dominance. It wasn't just about their own reputation. In that chamber, they carried the weight of communities who knew too well what it felt like to be bullied, to be threatened, to be silenced. They understood that this moment was bigger than themselves. It was about immigrants watching at home who had been told to go back. It was about workers who had been talked over in boardrooms. It was about every voice that had been dismissed as less worthy, less American. And so they did not flinch. They did not raise their voice. They met the threat with the same unyielding composure they had been building their entire life. It was this resilience that would soon transform a threat into a lesson for the entire nation. The exchange began with sharp edges, but still within the bounds of debate. Pete Hegseth leaned forward, voice carrying the kind of manufactured outrage that had made him a television fixture. He accused, he belittled, each phrase dipped in contempt. What started as disagreement over policy quickly tilted into something far more personal. His words no longer targeted arguments, they targeted the host themselves. "You don't understand real America?" he barked, his volume climbing with every sentence. He jabbed the air with his finger, as if force alone could make his accusations true. His tone dripped with disdain, calculated to humiliate rather than persuade. Yet across the table, the liberal host met every surge with poise. They didn't match his anger. Instead, they deflected with precision, their replies calm, measured, almost surgical in their restraint. "I hear your passion," they said evenly, before steering the conversation back to facts, to values, to the people whose lives hung in the balance of the policies being discussed, and that composure only fueled Hegseth's frustration. The louder he grew, the more irrelevant his anger seemed against the backdrop of the host's unshaken calm. The chamber, sensing the clash escalating, fell into silence. Staffers stopped their note-taking. Lawmakers leaned in. The air itself seemed to tighten, thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the two figures locked in a duel of presence, one flailing louder, the other growing stronger through silence. It was no longer just a hearing, it was theater, and everyone knew the climax was near. And then Pete Hegseth leaned in, and the words he unleashed sent shockwaves through the chamber. The words left Pete Hegseth's mouth like a loaded weapon, low, seething, unmistakably meant as a threat. For a moment, the chamber froze, caught between disbelief and outrage. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Staffers shifted in their seats, eyes wide. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts, capturing the exact second civility broke and hostility took its place. The air was no longer heavy with debate, it was charged with danger. Hegseth leaned back as if satisfied, his threat hanging in the silence like smoke after an explosion. He expected fear. He expected retreat, but what came instead was something he had never prepared for, composure so absolute it transformed the very atmosphere of the room. The liberal host did not flinch. They sat still, spine straight, gaze unwavering. That silence, the kind that stretched long enough to feel like defiance, was their first counterattack. It turned the weight of Hegseth's words back onto him, exposing the hollowness of his aggression. The longer they waited, the more unsettled he became. His attempt at dominance had created a stage, and now he was the one left squirming under its lights. Then came the response, deliberate and unhurried. The host's voice was calm, but it carried with it the gravity of truth. "You can try to threaten me," they said, every syllable crisp, "but what you can't threaten is the truth. And the truth is that fear doesn't make this country stronger." "It makes it weaker," a murmur ran through the chamber, like an undercurrent gathering strength. The host paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting once again. Each pause became a punctuation mark, magnifying the words already spoken. Hegseth shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked less like a warrior and more like a man caught off guard. He attempted an interruption, but the host's steady cadence drowned out his bluster without raising in volume. "Threats," the host continued, "are the language of someone who has already lost the argument. They reveal desperation, not strength. They show the world that you have run out of ideas, and all you have left is intimidation." The room erupted with murmurs of agreement. A few lawmakers even nodded, their eyes darting between the two figures like spectators at a duel who suddenly realized the tide had turned. Outside the chamber, social media lit up instantly. Clips circulated within minutes. Hashtags surged, outrage spread, and admiration for the host's composure began trending. "This is what courage looks like," one post read. "This is what standing tall against hate means," said another. The moment had leapt beyond those walls, becoming part of the national conversation in real time. Meanwhile, inside the hearing, the transformation was unmistakable. Hegseth's volume no longer commanded the room, it betrayed his unraveling. His interruptions sounded shrill, defensive, almost panicked against the calm rhythm of the host's words. The harder he tried to claw back control, the further it slipped from his grasp, and then came the line that sealed the moment. The host leaned forward slightly, mirroring Hegseth's earlier aggression but without a trace of menace. Their voice remained steady, cutting through the air with precision. "You think power is about making people afraid of you. But real power? Real power is earning respect even from those who disagree with you. That's something you've never understood." The chamber fell utterly silent. For a beat, time itself seemed to pause. Hegseth's face flushed, his jaw tightening, his bravado cracked open for all to see. The cameras caught everything, the bully exposed, the mask slipping, and in that silence, the truth became undeniable. The threat had not silenced the host, it had amplified them. The arrogance that was supposed to intimidate had instead revealed its own weakness, the threat, backfired, turning into the very moment that exposed Hegseth's weakness. When the echoes of that confrontation settled, it became clear this moment was never just about two individuals sparring in a congressional chamber. It was about the very character of American democracy, tested in real time before the nation's eyes. On one side stood the embodiment of fear, loud, threatening, desperate to control through intimidation. On the other stood dignity, calm, unshaken, unwilling to bow to hostility. The host, still composed, spoke not for themselves but for every person who had ever been told to be quiet, to step aside, to accept less. "This chamber," they declared, "does not belong to bullies. It belongs to the people. And the people deserve leaders who fight with integrity, not with threats." Their words landed with the weight of a moral verdict, echoing far beyond the walls of Congress. The contrast could not have been starker. Threats reveal weakness, a fear of losing ground. Dignity reveals strength, the kind that endures, the kind that inspires. In that single exchange, the host transformed a personal attack into a lesson on the values that sustain the nation: respect over ridicule, justice over arrogance, democracy over domination. And for those watching, the message was unmistakable. True strength is not measured by volume or menace, but by integrity in the face of intimidation. That day, dignity stood taller than fear. Pete Hegseth may have tried to intimidate, but instead, he revealed the true power of calm courage. What was meant as a threat became a national lesson, a reminder that arrogance burns hot but burns out quickly, while dignity endures. In that chamber, the balance of power shifted, not because one voice grew louder, but because another refused to break. This was never just about politics. It was about character. It was about who we choose to be as a nation when fear and anger try to dominate the conversation. And what we saw was proof that arrogance cannot outlast integrity, and hostility cannot overshadow truth. Moments like these matter because they remind us of the values worth fighting for: respect, justice, democracy. They remind us that the real test of strength is not how forcefully someone can threaten, but how firmly someone can stand for what is right. If you believe in those values, if you believe that courage, dignity, and truth are the bedrock of this country, then join us. Subscribe to witness more moments where truth dismantles hostility, where arrogance is exposed, and where democracy's brightest voices rise above the noise. And don't keep this moment to yourself. Share it, spread it. Remind others that democracy thrives not on threats but on courage, because in America, it's not the loudest voice that wins, it's the truest.